The mill wheel had not turned in 3 days, not since the soldiers came through Hartwell village and left the mill pond red at its edges. Elspeth Hartley stood at the sluice gate that night, with her hand pressed against the cold iron, listening to the wind carry the last screams of a battle fought 2 miles east across Marsden Moor. She was 31 years old, a miller's widow with flower-white calluses on her palms and a boy of 9 asleep in the loft above her, and she had learned in the 18 months since her husband's death that survival in Lancashire during this war meant choosing, always, the safest silence. That was why, when she found the young man collapsed against the mill race with his doublet soaked through black in the moonlight, her first instinct was to leave him. She did not leave him. He was perhaps 22, with the kind of fine-boned face that spoke of a childhood spent indoors, away from harvest sun, and a sword still buckled at his hip, though his hand could no longer close around the hilt. A musket ball had passed through his shoulder and lodged somewhere near his ribs, and the blood soaking his shirt told her he had perhaps 2 hours before the cold finished what the wound had started. Around his throat, half hidden beneath torn linen, hung a signet ring on a leather cord, a stag rampant beneath a coronet, the mark of the House of Ashcombe. Elspeth had seen that mark before. She had seen it on the banners of the men who rode through Hartwell 18 months past, the same men whose commander had ordered her husband dragged from their doorway and shot in the mud for the crime of refusing to surrender the mill's grain stores. She knew, kneeling there with her knees soaking through her skirts, that the boy dying in front of her was almost certainly the son of the very duke whose war had made her a widow. She dragged him inside anyway. It took her the better part of an hour to get him up the narrow stairs to the grain loft, using the pulley rope meant for hauling sacks of flour, her son Tom woken by the scraping, and sent, wide-eyed and silent, to hold the lantern steady. She packed the wound with yarrow and spider's silk the way her grandmother had taught her, bound his shoulder with strips torn from her own petticoat, and buried him beneath 3 feet of barley in the loft's deepest corner, leaving only a narrow breathing channel through a hollowed grain sack. "Who is he, ma'am?" Tom whispered, when it was done, and they stood together in the flour-dusted dark. "Nobody," Elspeth said. "Nobody at all, until he can walk out of this mill on his own 2 feet." She told herself it was mercy alone that moved her, that whatever hatred she carried for the House of Ashcombe, she could not let a dying boy freeze in her mill race while she slept warm. But some smaller, more honest part of her recognized the calculation beneath the compassion. A nobleman's son, alive and grateful, might be worth more to a struggling widow than a nobleman's son left dead in the mud. She hated herself faintly for the thought, and did not examine it further. By dawn, the countryside knew what had happened on the moor. Word came through the baker's boy, breathless and pale, that the parliamentarian forces had routed the royalist column, that the Duke of Ashcombe's eldest son and heir, Lord Rowan Ashcombe, had been seen falling from his horse during the retreat, and had not been recovered. Dead, wounded, or fled, no one could say. A reward of £20, an unthinkable sum, was already being spoken of in the village square for any soul who could produce him, living or dead, to the garrison commander now quartered at Hartwell Hall. Elspeth heard the number and felt something cold settle in her stomach. £20 would clear her husband's debts twice over. £20 would buy Tom an apprenticeship, a future beyond flour dust and drought years. And upstairs, buried under barley with a breathing tube pressed to his lips, lay exactly the man everyone in 3 counties was searching for. She had a choice to make, and precious little time in which to make it. Because that same afternoon, a detachment of parliamentarian soldiers under a young captain named Josiah Fenwick arrived at her gate, asking whether the mill had seen any strangers pass through in the night, and whether Widow Hartley might permit them to search the grounds. Elspeth wiped her hands on her apron, forced her voice steady, and opened the door wide. "Search wherever you like, Captain," she said. "I've nothing to hide." The lie tasted like copper on her tongue. Somewhere above her head, beneath 3 feet of grain, she heard, or imagined she heard, the faintest rasp of a wounded man's breath. and she understood, with the clarity of a woman stepping off a cliff, that she had just committed treason against the government of England, and that there would be no undoing it now. Captain Fenwick's search of the mill lasted the better part of an hour, and Elspeth spent every minute of it standing in the yard with Tom's hand gripped tight in hers, reciting silently every prayer she still half believed in. The soldiers overturned sacks in the ground-floor storeroom, prodded at the hay in the small stable, and climbed halfway up the loft ladder before one of them, a broad-shouldered man named Corporal Pyle, declared the grain too tightly packed to hide so much as a cat, let alone a grown man, and climbed back down grumbling about wasted daylight. Fenwick himself lingered longer than the others. He was younger than Elspeth had expected for a captain, no more than 25, with the careful, watchful eyes of a man who had learned early that war rewarded caution over courage. He asked her twice whether she had heard riders in the night, and twice she told him no, her voice flat and unhurried, though her pulse hammered so hard she feared he might hear it. "You understand, Widow Hartley," he said finally, standing at the mill's threshold with his hand resting on the doorframe, "that harboring a fugitive of the Crown's cause, even unknowingly, carries a penalty of death. Parliament does not distinguish between the man who fires the musket and the woman who hides him after." "I understand it well, Captain," Elspeth answered. "My husband died for less." Something flickered across Fenwick's face at that, not quite guilt, but its distant cousin, and he did not press her further. He mounted his horse and led his men back toward the village, and Elspeth stood in her doorway until the last of them had vanished over the rise, before she allowed her knees to buckle and caught herself against the frame. That night, once Tom was asleep, she climbed to the loft alone and dug the young lord free of the barley with her bare hands, terrified of what she might find. He was alive, though barely, his skin burning with fever, his lips cracked and murmuring words she could not follow. She spent the small hours changing his dressing, feeding him broth a spoonful at a time, and it was somewhere in the gray hour before dawn, wiping sweat from his brow with a damp cloth, that he opened his eyes fully for the first time and looked at her. "You should let me die," he rasped. "You'd be safer." "I know," she said. "Drink this." He drank, because he had no strength left to argue, and over the following days, as his fever slowly broke, Elspeth learned things about Rowan Ashcombe that unsettled the simple hatred she had carried for his family. He spoke of his father, the Duke, with a wariness that bordered on fear rather than filial devotion. He asked, twice, whether the village of Hartwell had suffered during the war's early raids, and when Elspeth told him coldly precisely what had happened to her husband, something in his face went genuinely ashen. "That raid was ordered by my father's steward, Marcus Vane," Rowan said quietly. "I was there. I argued against it. I was overruled, and I was young enough, cowardly enough, to let myself be overruled without further protest. I have thought of that morning more times than you would believe, Widow Hartley, and I am sorrier for it than any words of mine could make believable to you." Elspeth said nothing to that, not that night, but she found she believed him, and the believing frightened her more than his family name ever had, because it meant the clean, simple story she had told herself, Duke's son, enemy, means to an end, was no longer clean or simple at all. The days that followed brought their own dangers. Twice more soldiers came through Hartwell asking after the missing lord, and twice more Elspeth turned them away with a steady voice and a swept-clean yard. Village gossip grew sharper. Her neighbor Agnes Thorne, a sharp-eyed widow herself, remarked one market morning that Elspeth had been buying twice her usual flour and meat for a household of 2, and Elspeth felt the remark land like a struck bell. She began rationing more carefully, took to grinding a portion of grain at odd hours to explain the noise from the loft, and taught Tom, gently but firmly, exactly what he must never say and to whom. It was Agnes, in fact, who nearly undid everything. arriving unannounced one afternoon with a basket of mending and climbing halfway up the loft stairs, before Elspeth managed to intercept her with a fabricated story about rats nesting in the grain. Agnes's eyes lingered too long on the fresh straw scattered suspiciously near the ladder, and though she said nothing more that day, Elspeth understood she had bought herself, at most, a few more weeks of unquestioned secrecy. Rowan, healing but still too weak to walk unaided, began to understand the weight of what Elspeth risked on his behalf, and it changed something in how he spoke to her. Less the careless confidence of a nobleman, more the halting gratitude of a man who had never before owed his life to someone with nothing to gain from the debt. "When I am strong enough to travel," he told her one evening, "I will find some way to see you rewarded for this. My father has estates, income, influence enough to—" "I don't want your father's money," Elspeth cut in, sharper than she intended. "I want you gone from this mill before it gets my son killed." The words hung between them, harsh and honest, and Rowan studied her for a long moment before answering, quietly, that he understood, and that he was more sorry than she knew for the danger his presence had brought to her door. But leaving, they both understood, was not so simple. He was too weak to travel more than a mile without collapsing. The countryside for 10 miles around crawled with parliamentarian patrols still hunting him. And worse, a piece of information reached Elspeth through Agnes's endless gossip network that made her blood run cold. Captain Fenwick's superior, a colonel newly arrived from London, had begun to suspect that Hartwell's mill had not been searched thoroughly enough, and intended to return within the week with orders to tear the building apart board by board if necessary. The colonel's name was Bertram Ashworth, and he arrived at Hartwell 4 days later with 20 men, a stated intention to search every structure within the village bounds, and a manner that made Captain Fenwick's earlier courtesy look, in retrospect, almost gentle. Elspeth watched from her window as his column rode past the mill toward the village green, and she understood, with a certainty that settled like stone in her chest, that the narrow margin of safety she had been living within was about to close entirely. She and Rowan spoke that night in urgent, low voices, working through every possibility and discarding each in turn. He was strong enough now to stand, to walk a slow circuit of the loft, but not strong enough to outrun mounted soldiers across open moorland, and the roads in every direction were watched. Hiding him again beneath the grain would not survive a thorough search. Ashworth's men, she had learned, carried long steel probes specifically designed to be driven into hay and grain stores in search of concealed bodies. It was Rowan who proposed the plan that terrified her most. That he present himself not as Lord Rowan Ashcombe, fugitive heir, but as a common laborer, a miller's hired hand taken on to help Elspeth manage the mill's work since her husband's death. A plausible enough story, given how many widows across the county had been forced to hire help. He would need a false name, a convincing manner, and an explanation for the healing wound beneath his shirt that did not involve muskets or Moors. "They know your face," Elspeth objected. "Someone in that column fought beside you, or against you. It only takes one man to recognize you, and we're both dead." "Then we make certain no one looks closely enough to recognize anything," Rowan said, and there was a new steel in his voice that had not been there during his fever-sick first days in her loft. "Cover me in flour dust and grain chaff. Give me a laborer's stoop and a laborer's silence. A duke's son does not grind wheat, Widow Hartley. No one searching for Lord Ashcombe will look twice at a miller's man with dirt under his fingernails." It was a desperate plan, built on the thin hope that appearance alone could overcome recognition, but Elspeth could think of nothing better, and dawn was already lightening the sky by the time they finished preparing. She cut his hair rough and uneven with kitchen shears, rubbed ash and flour into his hands and face, until the fine bones of his cheeks looked weathered rather than aristocratic, and dressed him in her dead husband's work clothes, a decision that cost her more than she let herself acknowledge, watching another man fill the shape of the shirt William had worn to his death. She gave him a name. Nathaniel Combe, chosen deliberately close enough to his true name that he would not stumble over it if addressed suddenly, and a story, a laborer from Preston, whose own mill had burned in the fighting, taken on by the widow Hartley for room, board, and a small wage. Colonel Ashworth's men reached the mill by mid-morning. Elspeth stood in the yard as they had before. Tom pressed silent against her skirts, and beside her stood Rowan, Nathaniel now, in every gesture she could coach into him. With his eyes lowered, and his shoulders stooped in the posture of a man accustomed to being overlooked. Ashworth himself dismounted to conduct the search personally, a lean, hard-eyed man whose gaze swept across the yard and settled, for one unbearable moment, directly on Rowan's face. "You," Ashworth said. "Name." "Nathaniel Combe, sir." Rowan's voice came out rougher than his natural register, flattened into something that might have passed for a Lancashire labourer's accent, to an ear not trained to notice the difference. "Hired hand, sir. Widow Hartley took me on after my own mill burned near Preston." Ashworth studied him a moment longer than Elspeth's heart could comfortably bear, then grunted and turned toward the mill door, ordering his men inside. The search that followed was more thorough than Fenwick's had been. The probing rods driven into every grain sack, the floorboards tested for hollow sounds, the stable and outbuildings stripped bare. And through all of it, Elspeth stood in the yard with her pulse roaring in her ears, watching Rowan maintain his laborer's slouch, even as two soldiers walked directly past him without a second glance. They found nothing, because there was nothing left to find, and Ashworth's column rode on toward the next village an hour later, no wiser for their trouble. But the danger had not passed. It had only shifted shape. That evening, as Elspeth allowed herself to breathe for the first time in a full day, Agnes Thorne appeared again at her door, her expression tight with something between suspicion and dawning understanding. She had seen Nathaniel in the yard during the search, she said, and something about his bearing had struck her as wrong, too straight-backed beneath the stoop, too careful with his consonants for a Preston laborer. "I don't know what you're hiding, Elspeth Hartley," Agnes said quietly, glancing past her toward the mill, "and perhaps I don't want to know. But others in this village are not so slow to notice as you might hope, and there's talk already starting about that hired man of yours." The revelation that followed struck Elspeth harder than any soldier's search. Agnes was not merely observing. She was warning, out of some old loyalty between widows who had buried husbands within a season of each other, that Elspeth's secret was already unraveling in the village's quiet channels of gossip, and that discovery, when it came, might not arrive on a colonel's authority at all, but through the far more dangerous mechanism of a neighbor's whispered word to the wrong ears in exchange for £20 reward. Agnes's warning proved prophetic within 3 days. Elspeth learned, through a frightened stable boy who owed her a debt of kindness from years past, that a man named Silas Crabb, a Hartwell tenant known throughout the village for debts he could not pay and a willingness to sell information for coin, had gone to Colonel Ashworth's garrison that very morning, claiming he had reason to believe the widow Hartley's new hired hand was not what he appeared to be. There was no time left for caution. Elspeth found Rowan in the mill's grinding room and told him, without preamble, that soldiers would almost certainly return before nightfall, and that this time no amount of flour dust or borrowed stooping would save him from Colonel Ashworth's scrutiny once suspicion had already been planted in the man's mind. It was Rowan who made the decision that changed everything. A decision Elspeth would later understand as the true turning point of the entire ordeal, more significant even than the night she had first dragged him from the mill race. Rather than fleeing, rather than asking Elspeth to hide him again and risk both their lives on another desperate deception, he told her he intended to ride to the garrison himself, openly, and reveal his true identity, not as a fugitive captured, but as a man surrendering under specific and deliberate terms. "You'll be executed," Elspeth said, horror rising in her voice. "Ashworth will hang you the moment he confirms who you are." "He might," Rowan agreed. "But my father commands considerable ransom value to Parliament's cause, and colonels who capture dukes' heirs alive receive far greater reward and advancement than colonels who hang them in a fit of battlefield temper. Ashworth is ambitious, Elspeth. I could see it in the way he searched your mill, the care he took to do everything correctly for men watching his career. He will want to present me alive to his superiors, not dead in your yard. It was a gamble built on cold political calculation rather than certainty, and Elspeth argued against it for the better part of an hour, but Rowan's mind was set, sharpened by a resolve she had not seen in him since the night she first found him bleeding in the mill race. Before he rode out on the mill's old cart horse, the only mount available to them, he turned back to her with something urgent in his expression. "Whatever happens to me," he said, "you and your son must never be implicated. I will tell them I forced my way into your mill unknown to you, that I threatened you and the boy into silence. Swear to me you'll say the same, whatever question they put to you." Elspeth swore it, though the lie sat bitter in her throat, and she watched him ride toward the garrison with a knot of dread lodged beneath her ribs that did not loosen for 2 full days. The story that reached Hartwell village over the following week arrived in pieces, each more astonishing than the last. Lord Rowan Ashcombe had indeed surrendered himself to Colonel Ashworth, and Ashworth, precisely as Rowan had predicted, had recognized the considerable value of a living captive heir over a dead rebel, and had transported him under guard to London rather than executing him on Hartwell soil. More extraordinary still, Rowan had used what influence remained to him during the negotiations surrounding his ransom and eventual parole to secure written protection for the widow Hartley's mill and household, formally absolving her of any charge of harboring, and further, in a gesture that stunned the entire village, arranging for a private settlement of funds sufficient to clear every debt her late husband had left behind. Silas Crabb, whose informing had set the crisis in motion, received nothing for his trouble. Colonel Ashworth, having achieved his prize through the fugitive's own surrender rather than through informant testimony, saw no reason to reward a debt-ridden tenant for information that had ultimately proven unnecessary. Elspeth did not see Rowan Ashcombe again for nearly a year, through the long, uncertain months of his parole negotiations and his father's eventual, grudging acceptance of the peace terms that ended that stretch of England's long civil war. When he did return to Hartwell, it was quietly, without banners or escort, on a gray autumn afternoon, much like the one on which she had first found him dying in her mill race. He stood in her doorway, older around the eyes than his years should have allowed, and told her that he had thought of her constantly during his confinement, not merely with gratitude, though that ran deep and would never fully drain from him, but with something he had struggled to name until enforced stillness had given him the time to examine it honestly. Elspeth, who had spent that same year telling herself firmly that whatever she had felt watching him heal in her loft was nothing more than the ordinary tenderness of a nurse for her patient, found the careful walls of that explanation harder to maintain with him standing in her doorway once more. Flower dust and danger both long since settled into memory rather than immediate threat. She did not give him an answer that afternoon. But she did not close the door, either. And Tom, watching from the loft ladder with the particular clear-eyed understanding of children who have lived through more than their years should have asked of them, later told his mother that he had known, even then, that Lord Ashcombe would not be a stranger in their mill again. The war itself ground on elsewhere in England for years after that autumn afternoon, and Hartwell village, like so many others, carried its scars quietly into the peace that eventually followed. But within the walls of one small mill beside a mill race that had once run red with battle's aftermath, something more durable than war had taken root. Not the clean, simple justice Elspeth might once have imagined for a duke's son who owed her his life, but something more complicated and more honest. Two people who had each risked everything the other could not repay, choosing, in the quiet years that followed, to build something neither treason nor war could take from them again.